Wyoming Territory, 1891. The blizzard struck with the fury of an angry god, turning the world into a swirling maze of white death. Elijah Boone hunched deeper into his worn coat, his horse's hooves finding purchase on the treacherous trail more by instinct than sight. The wind howled through the canyon walls like the voices of all the men who died in this unforgiving land, and Elijah wondered if tonight he'd join their chorus. Then, through the sheets of snow, he saw her, a dark shape against the white, crumpled by the roadside like a discarded doll. His heart hammered as he dismounted, boots sinking into the drift. She was barely breathing, blood frozen on her temple, clutching something against her chest. A letter, soaked through, but he could make out the name written in careful script. His own name, Elijah Boone. But how could a dying stranger in the wilderness be carrying a letter addressed to a man who'd been dead inside for 2 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered gravestone against the Wyoming sky, its logs dark with age and neglect. Elijah Boone had built it with his brother Thomas 15 years ago, when they'd both been young enough to believe in tomorrow and foolish enough to think love would follow them to this godforsaken territory. Now the place felt like a mausoleum, every creak of the floorboards echoing with ghosts. Elijah kicked the snow from his boots and shouldered through the door, the unconscious woman heavy in his arms. She was small-boned but solid, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and skin pale as prairie moonlight. Blood had dried on her temple, and her dress, what he could see of it beneath the torn coat, was torn and muddy. Someone had hurt her, left her for dead in the storm. The letter crackled in his coat pocket as he laid her on Thomas's old bed. His brother had died in that bed 2 winters past, coughing up blood until his lungs finally gave out from the fever that had taken half the territory. Elijah had burned the sheets, scrubbed the frame, even moved it to the far corner of the cabin. But he'd never been able to bring himself to sleep in it again. He built up the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth, then fetched water from the pump handle was frozen solid, and he had to pour hot water over it twice before it would budge. Winter was a relentless enemy out here, claiming more lives than drought, Indians, or outlaws combined. It killed with patience, wearing you down day by day until you simply forgot how to fight back. Dot as he cleaned the blood from her face. Elijah found himself studying her features. She had a strong jaw and high cheekbones that spoke of stubborn pride, the kind of woman who'd spit in the devil's eye if he crossed her path. Her hands were soft, but calloused in places that suggested she wasn't afraid of work. A lady, maybe, but one who'd known hardship. Who was she? And why did she have a letter with his name on it? Elijah had received exactly 3 letters in his entire life. The first had come from his mother back in Ohio, telling him his father was dead. The second had been from the army, informing him that his service as a scout was no longer required. The third had arrived just last month, a notice from the territorial government about unpaid taxes on the homestead. None of them had been worth the paper they were written on. The woman stirred, mumbling something in her sleep. Her voice carried the soft vowels of the South, honey over gravel. Elijah found himself leaning closer to hear, then caught himself and stepped back. He'd grown too accustomed to solitude, too comfortable with the silence that had settled over. His life like dust over an abandoned house. Thomas would have laughed at him. His brother had always been the charmer, the one who could coax a smile from the sorest preacher's wife or talk a hostile brave into sharing his fire. "You're too serious, Eli," he'd say, usually while pouring another drink or dealing another hand of cards. Life's too short to spend it frowning. Thomas had been wrong about that. Life wasn't too short. It was too long. Too long to spend missing the dead. Too long to spend alone in a cabin that creaked with emptiness. Too long to spend wondering what might have been. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and Elijah found himself staring into the deepest brown he'd ever seen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillow. "Easy," Elijah said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You've been hurt." "Where?" Her voice was whisper-soft, edged with pain and confusion. "Where am I? My cabin? Found you in the storm." He poured water into a tin cup and held it out to her. "You were near frozen." She studied his face as if memorizing it, then accepted. The cup with shaking hands. "Thank you." The words came out formal, careful. I'm Annabel Hart." The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd heard it before, whispered in fevered dreams and drunken confessions. Thomas had spoken of Anne. Annabel, a girl he'd left behind in Georgia. But that had been years ago, before they'd come west, before Thomas had given up on the idea of marriage and family. "You know that name," she said, watching his face. Elijah nodded slowly. "My brother used to know an Annabel, in Georgia." Her eyes widened, and her hand went instinctively to her throat. "Thomas? Thomas Boone?" The confirmation hit him like a slap. "He's dead." The cup slipped from her fingers, water splashing across the quilt. Her face went white as the snow outside, and for a moment Elijah thought she might faint again. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. "When?" she whispered. 2 years passed. Fever took him. She was quiet for so long that Elijah began to wonder if she'd fallen asleep. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him with a clarity that made him uncomfortable. "You're Elijah," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you?" "He talked about you. Said you were the steady one, the one who kept him grounded." Her voice carried a sadness that seemed to fill the entire cabin. "He wrote to me, asked me to come west, to be his wife." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Thomas had never mentioned writing to anyone, never spoken of plans for marriage. But then, Thomas had kept his own counsel about many things, especially toward the end, when the fever dreams had taken hold. "I'm sorry," Elijah said, and meant it. "If I'd known." "You couldn't have known." Annabel struggled to sit up again, this time managing to prop herself against the wall. "The letter I received was dated just 3 months ago. Someone arranged for me to come here. Paid for my passage, made all the arrangements." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air crept up Elijah's spine. "Who?" "A man named Cassidy. Said he was a friend of Thomas's, that Thomas had asked him to help with the arrangements because he was too sick to travel." Her voice grew smaller. "I sold everything I had to get here. My mother's china, my father's books, even the silver hair combs that had been in our family for 3 generations. Elijah had never heard Thomas mention anyone named Cassidy. His brother had been a sociable man, quick to make friends and even quicker to trust them, but he'd been careful about the people he let close. And he'd certainly never been one to plan ahead, especially not for something as serious as marriage. "This Cassidy," Elijah said carefully. "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, dark eyes. Dressed like a gentleman. But there was something about him, ... double quotes, she shivered. And not from cold. Something that made my skin crawl. But he had Thomas's letter, and he knew details about your homestead, about the territory. I thought..." She trailed off, and Elijah saw tears gathering in her eyes. He felt an unexpected urge to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right, but he'd learned long ago that such promises were usually lies. "What happened to you?" He asked, instead, "How did you end up hurt, alone in the storm?" Annabel's face hardened, and for a moment he saw the steel beneath the fragile exterior. "Cassidy brought me most of the way, then said he had business in town. Left me at the way station, with instructions to wait for Thomas. But Thomas never came, and the station keeper said he'd never heard of any Boones in the territory." She paused, and Elijah could see her gathering strength for the rest of the story. I waited 3 days. Then Cassidy came back, but he was different, angry. Said there had been complications, that Thomas was delayed. He wanted me to come with him, to wait somewhere else. Her voice dropped to a whisper. When I refused, he grabbed me, tried to force me into his wagon. I fought him, and he struck me, sent me tumbling into the snow. By the time I got my bearings, he was gone. Rage, hot and sudden, flared in Elijah's chest. It had been so long since he'd felt anything that intense that it almost knocked him over. Someone had hurt this woman, had left her to die in a blizzard, and every instinct he possessed was screaming for justice. I'll find him, he said, the words coming out harsh and raw. No. Annabel's voice was firm despite her weakened state. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me. I just ... I need to figure out what to do next. Elijah looked at her looked at her for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty tempered by hardship and loss. Her dress was fine quality but worn, her hands soft but not pampered. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that comes from facing down life's worst and refusing to break. Thomas would have loved her. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he turned away to hide the sudden grief that threatened to overwhelm him. His brother had died alone, fevered and afraid, never knowing that somewhere in Georgia, a woman was preparing to cross half a continent to be his wife. Never knowing that someone had been coming to share his dreams and ease his loneliness. You can stay here, Elijah said abruptly, until you figure out what you want to do. Annabel studied his face. Why would you do that? You don't know me. Thomas cared about you. That's enough. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all the truth he was prepared to acknowledge. The rest, the way her presence had already begun to warm the cold corners of the cabin, the way her voice had broken through the silence that had settled over his days like a shroud that was something he'd examine later, when she was asleep and he could think clearly again. I won't impose on your kindness, she said. I can work, earn my keep. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm sure you're not. Elijah found himself almost smiling, something he hadn't done in months. Rest now. We'll figure out the details tomorrow. As Annabel settled back against the pillows, Elijah retreated to his own side of the cabin. He pulled out the letter. She'd been clutching and examined it in the firelight. The paper was expensive, the handwriting careful and educated, but something about it felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what Thomas had been many things charming. Reckless, generous to a fault, but he'd never been much of a letter writer. His spelling had been atrocious, his penmanship barely legible. This letter was too neat, too formal, too much like something written by someone who wanted to impress rather than someone pouring out his heart. Elijah folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Tomorrow he'd ask more questions, try to piece together what had really happened. Tonight, he just wanted to sit by the fire and listen to another human being breathe in the darkness. For the first time in 2 years, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. Morning broke gray and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Elijah woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been biscuits, sent so foreign to his cabin that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. Then he heard humming a low, sweet melody that seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of the room. Annabel stood at his stove, moving with the careful precision of someone still fighting pain, but too stubborn to admit it. She'd braided her dark hair and somehow managed to clean and mend her dress, though it still bore the stains of her ordeal. A leather satchel sat open on the table beside her, revealing an assortment of small bottles and cloth pouches. You're up early for someone who nearly froze to death yesterday, Elijah said. She turned, offering him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm not much for lying about. Coffee's ready, and I found some flour that wasn't completely weevil-eaten. Elijah accepted the cup she handed him, surprised by the warmth that spread through his chest at such a simple gesture. It had been so long since anyone had made him coffee that he'd forgotten how it felt to be cared for, even in such a small way. "That your medicine kit?" he asked, nodding toward the satchel. "Herbs and such. My grandmother taught me." Hannibal's voice carried a note of pride. Said a woman should know how to heal as well as hurt, especially if she planned to make her way in the world without depending on any man's charity. There was steel in her voice when she said it, and Elijah found himself reassessing his assumptions about the fragile southern belle he'd rescued from the storm. This woman had crossed half a continent alone, had fought off an attacker, and survived a blizzard. Whatever else she might be, she wasn't helpless. Smart woman, your grandmother. She was. Hannibal poured herself coffee and settled into the chair across from him. Taught me that knowledge is the one thing nobody can take away from you, no matter how hard they try. Something in her tone suggested she spoke from experience, but before Elijah could ask, she was studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. "You look like him," she said quietly. "Thomas, same jaw, same way of holding your shoulders, but your eyes are different." "How so?" His were full of laughter, even when he was sad. "Yours ... Doppelcoat." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "Yours look like they've forgotten how to hope." The observation hit closer to home than Elijah cared to admit. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of not hoping, not wanting, not caring about anything beyond the next sunrise. It was safer that way. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when everything he'd ever cared about had been taken away. "Hope's a dangerous thing out here," he said. "So is despair?" Hannibal took a sip of her coffee, never breaking eye contact. "Tell me about him. About Thomas." Elijah found himself talking without meaning to, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. He told her about Thomas's laugh, his terrible jokes, his habit of singing off-key while he worked. He told her about the dreams they'd shared of building something lasting in this harsh land, of the plans they'd made and the future they'd envisioned. He didn't tell her about the drinking that had started after their first hard winter, or the gambling bets that had nearly cost them the homestead. He didn't mention the reckless chances Thomas had taken, the way he'd seemed determined to court danger, as if daring the territory to finish him off. Some truths were too heavy to share with a stranger, no matter how kind her eyes. "He would have loved you," Elijah said finally, surprised by the rawness in his own voice. "Would he?" Hannibal's smile was sad and knowing. "I wonder sometimes if the man who wrote those letters was real, or just someone I wanted to believe." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. Letters, Elijah realized, written in the same careful script he'd seen on the one she'd been clutching in the storm. "May I?" he asked. Hannibal hesitated, then handed him the bundle. "I suppose you have a right to know what your brother was thinking." Elijah untied the ribbon and spread the letters on the table. There were more than a dozen, each one several pages long. As he read, his frown deepened. The handwriting was too neat, the language too formal. These weren't the words of a man pouring out his heart. They were the calculated phrases of someone trying to seduce a woman he'd never met. "These aren't from Thomas," he said finally. "What do you mean?" Elijah pulled out a scrap of paper from his shirt pocket, a note Thomas had left him before one of his trips to town. The handwriting was completely different, loose and careless, where the letters were precise and controlled. Thomas couldn't spell worth a damn, and his penmanship was terrible. He used to joke that his writing looked like a chicken had fallen in an inkwell. Elijah set the papers side by side. These letters were written by someone else. The color drained from Hannibal's face. But they knew so much about him, about your homestead. They mentioned specific details, things only a close friend would know, or someone who'd spent time asking the right questions. Elijah felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest. Someone who wanted to convince a good woman to cross half a continent for a lie. Annabel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letters as if they might transform into something else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I sold everything. My mother's jewelry, my father's books, even the house where I was born. I gave up my whole life for a lie. The pain in her voice hit Elijah like a physical blow. He'd thought his own capacity for hurt had been exhausted, worn down by 2 years of grief and regret. But watching this woman confront the magnitude of her loss awakened something fierce and protective in his chest. Why? He asked. Why would someone go to such lengths to bring you here? I don't know. Annabel's hands shook as she gathered the letters. Unless ... Unless what? There was something else. Something I haven't told you. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. In Georgia, before I left, there was trouble. A man named Cassidy, the same man who arranged my passage, he was involved in some business that went bad. Very bad. Elijah waited, sensing that pushing would only make her retreat further into herself. My father was a lawyer, she continued. He represented some people who were inconvenient to Cassidy's interests. When my father died last year, Cassidy made it clear that certain debts were being asked down to his family. What kind of debts? Annabel turned back to face him, and Elijah saw fear flickering behind the determination in her eyes. The kind that can only be paid in blood or slavery. The word hung in the air between them like a curse. Elijah had heard stories of coarse women who disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The territories were full of men who saw females as property to be bought, sold, and used up like any other resource. So when Cassidy offered you a way out ... I thought it was salvation. A chance to start over, to build something good from the ashes of everything I'd lost. Her laugh was bitter. Instead, I walked right into his trap. Elijah stood and crossed to where she stood by the window. Without thinking, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through her at his touch. He won't find you here, he said quietly. You don't know him. He's patient, methodical. He'll keep looking until, then let him come. The words came out harder than Elijah had intended, edged with a violence that surprised them both. This is my land, and you're under my protection now. Annabel turned to face him, studying his expression with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Why? She asked. Why would you risk yourself for a stranger? It was a fair question, and one Elijah wasn't sure he could answer honestly. The smart thing would be to give her enough supplies to reach the nearest town and let her disappear into the vastness of the territory. The safe thing would be to send her away before Cassidy's trail led him to this remote homestead. But looking at her now, seeing the courage in her bearing, despite the fear in her eyes, the way she'd transformed his cold cabin into something resembling a home with nothing more than coffee and kindness, Elijah realized he didn't want to do the smart thing. Thomas would have wanted me to protect you. He said finally, it was true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than the hollow ache of grief. This woman had brought life back into his world, had reminded him that there were still things worth fighting for. Annabel searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but I won't be helpless baggage. If I'm staying, I'm earning my keep. It's not necessary. It is to me. Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. I've been dependent on the kindness of others my whole life. First my father, then the promise of a husband I'd never met. I'm tired of being something that happens to other people instead of someone who makes her own choices. Elijah found himself smiling for the second time in as many days. a sensation so foreign it felt like stretching a muscle that had been too long unused. In that case, he said, I could use help with the spring planting, and the cabin could use a woman's touch. Then it settled. Annabel extended her hand like a man sealing a business deal. Partners? Elijah took her hand, surprised by the calluses on her palm and the strength of her grip. Partners. As their hands touched, something passed between them. Not quite attraction, but not quite mere friendship either. It was the spark of possibility, the first tentative recognition that two lonely people might not have to face the world alone. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again on the horizon. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Elijah wasn't afraid of what the darkness might bring. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing, though neither Elijah nor Annabel spoke of it directly. She rose before dawn to start the coffee, moving quietly through the cabin with a consideration born of shared space and mutual respect. He chopped wood and tended the animals, pausing sometimes to watch her through the window as she organized his meager supplies with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to making much from little. They were careful with each other in those first weeks, polite as strangers sharing a stagecoach, neither wanting to presume too much or give offense. But gradually, the walls began to crumble. It started with small things. Annabel mending his shirts without being asked, her neat stitches a stark contrast to his own clumsy repairs. Elijah leaving wildflowers on the table after his morning rides, not saying where they'd come from, but watching her face light up when she discovered them. Conversations that began about practical matters, the best way to preserve meat, the signs of changing weather, and gradually deepened into something more personal. Tell me about Georgia, Elijah said one evening as they sat by the fire, the day's work done, Annabel's hands stilled on the sewing in her lap. She was working on something she'd been secretive about, turning away whenever he tried to get a glimpse of her project. What would you like to know? Whatever you're willing to share. She was quiet for so long that Elijah thought she might not answer. Then she set down her sewing and stared into the flames. It was beautiful in spring. The dogwood trees would bloom white as snow, and the air would smell like honeysuckle and jasmine. My mother had a garden behind our house roses, and magnolias and herbs for cooking. Her voice grew soft with memory. She used to say that a woman's worth could be measured by how well she could make things grow. Sounds like she was a wise woman. She was strong, too. Had to be married to a lawyer who spent more time fighting other people's battles than tending his own family. Annabel picked up her sewing again, her needle flashing in the firelight. She died when I was 16. Consumption. After that, it was just me and Papa, and he was changed by losing her. Elijah heard the pain beneath the carefully neutral words. He'd learned to recognize that particular quality of grief, the kind that carved hollow spaces in a person's chest and never quite filled them in again. Is that when you learned about healing, the herbs and such? Before that, actually. Mama started teaching me when I was just a girl. Said it was something every woman should know, especially if she wanted to help folks who couldn't afford a proper doctor. Annabel's smile was fond but sad. She'd take me with her when she visited the sick, teach me which plants could ease pain and which ones could stop bleeding. I probably learned more about medicine from her than some men do in medical school. Thomas would have appreciated that. He was always getting himself banged up somehow. Was he sickly? Before the fever, I mean? Elijah considered the question carefully. Thomas had been many things, but sickly wasn't one of them. If anything, his brother had been almost recklessly healthy, throwing himself into every adventure, with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. No, he said finally. Thomas was strong as an ox. The fever just ... It came on fast and hit hard. Nothing anyone could have done. It wasn't entirely true. There had been signs the persistent cough Thomas had dismissed as nothing, the way He'd grown thin and pale during that last winter. But Thomas had refused to admit weakness, and Elijah had been too proud to force the issue. By the time his brother had finally taken to his bed, it was too late for healing herbs or anything else. "I'm sorry," Annabel said quietly. "It must have been hard, watching him suffer." "He wasn't alone," Elijah said, though the words felt inadequate. "That's something, I suppose." They fell into comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon walls, but inside the cabin felt warm and safe. For the first time since Thomas's death, Elijah could imagine a future that didn't feel like an endless succession of empty days. "What's that you're working on?" he asked eventually, nodding toward her sewing. Annabel's cheeks flushed pink. It's probably foolish, but I found some old fabric in your storage chest. I hope you don't mind, but I thought I could make it into something useful." "Thomas's things?" "I assumed so." There was a shirt that was too far gone to mend, but the fabric was still good in places. She held up her work, and Elijah saw that. She was making a quilt, not the fancy kind with intricate patterns, but a simple, sturdy covering pieced together from scraps of Thomas's old clothes. The sight hit him harder than he'd expected. Those pieces of fabric carried memories. The blue shirt Thomas had worn to their first town dance, the brown work shirt he'd favored for breaking horses, the red flannel he'd claimed brought him luck at cards. "You don't have to," he started. "I want to," Annabel interrupted gently. It seemed wrong to let them just sit there gathering dust. This way, they'll still be useful, still be part of this place. Elijah nodded, not trusting his voice. It was such a simple gesture, but it spoke to something he'd been struggling with since Thomas's death, how to honor his brother's memory without being trapped by it, how to keep the good parts alive while still moving forward. "He'd like that," he managed finally. "I hope so." Annabel smoothed the fabric with careful fingers. "I've been thinking about what you said, about him loving me." "Do you really believe that?" The question caught Elijah off guard. He'd spoken without thinking that first morning, trying to offer comfort to a woman who'd lost everything. But now, watching her in the firelight, seeing the kindness in her eyes and the strength in her bearing, he found himself wondering what might have been. "Yes," he said, and meant it. Thomas had good taste in people, even if his judgment wasn't always the best in other matters. "He would have seen what I see." "And what's that?" Elijah met her eyes across the flickering flames. "A woman worth crossing a continent for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Annabel's breath caught, and for a moment Elijah thought she might say something that would change everything. Instead, she looked down at her sewing, her fingers suddenly clumsy with the needle. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to start over in a place where you don't know a soul. I know you're kind enough to turn scraps into something beautiful. I know you're strong enough to face down whatever's coming for you." Elijah leaned forward, his voice growing earnest. "I know you make coffee that doesn't taste like mud and biscuits that actually rise. In this territory, that alone makes you worth your weight in gold." That drew a laugh from her, the first genuine one he'd heard since the night he'd found her, in the storm. The sound filled the cabin with warmth, chasing away shadows he hadn't even realized were there. "Practical virtues," she said, but she was smiling. "The best kind. Pretty fades, but knowing how to survive that lasts." "Is that why you've never married? Too practical to believe in pretty words and romance?" The question sobered him. "Never found anyone willing to share this life. It's not easy out here, especially for a woman. Takes a special kind of person to choose hardship when they could have comfort somewhere else." "Maybe you were looking in the wrong places." "Maybe I was looking at all." Elijah stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "After Thomas died, I figured I was done with wanting things. Safer that way. But now? He turned back to find her watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Now I'm not so sure. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. They were still strangers in many ways, thrown together by circumstances neither had chosen. But something was growing in the spaces between. Their words, and the shared glances and small kindnesses that marked their days. The nightmares, Annabelle said suddenly. You have them too, don't you? Elijah nodded. He'd heard her crying out in her sleep, had seen the shadows under her eyes in the morning light. His own dreams were filled with images of Thomas gasping for breath, of opportunities missed and words left unspoken. Some nights I dream I'm back in Georgia, and Cassidy is at the door. Other nights I dream I never left, and I wake up wondering if any of this is real. She touched the wooden cross that hung at her throat, a simple thing carved from pine. This was my grandmother's. She said it would protect me from evil, but sometimes I think evil is too smart to be stopped by symbols. Maybe, but maybe symbols help us remember who we are when everything else falls apart. Annabelle smiled at that, and Elijah felt something loosen in his chest. They were finding their way toward each other, slowly and carefully, like travelers navigating by starlight. It wasn't the grand passion of storybooks, but it was real, built on shared work and quiet understanding rather than pretty words and false promises. I should let you sleep, he said, though he was reluctant to end the evening. Probably. Morning comes early out here. As Annabelle gathered her sewing and prepared for bed, Elijah found himself hoping that morning would take its time. These quiet hours by the fire had become precious to him, a reminder that not all of life's gifts came wrapped in tragedy and loss. Some came disguised as second chances, offered by dark-eyed women who turned scraps into quilts and loneliness, into something that might, with time and patience, grow into love. Spring arrived like a shy visitor, hesitant and uncertain after the harsh winter. The snow began to retreat in patches, revealing brown earth that steamed in the morning sun. Ice broke up on the creek with sounds like gunshots, and the first brave wildflowers pushed through the mud with a determination that reminded Elijah of the woman sharing his cabin. Annabelle had thrown herself into the work of preparing for the growing season with an energy that both impressed and worried him. She rose before dawn to tend seedlings she'd started in makeshift boxes by the window, her hands gentle as she coaxed life from soil and hope. When she wasn't nursing plants, she was cleaning, organizing, and generally transforming his bachelor quarters into something that resembled a home. You don't have to do all this, Elijah said one morning, finding her scrubbing his few dishes with sand and lye soap she'd made herself. I need to stay busy, she replied without looking up. Idle hands give the mind too much time to wander into dark places. He understood that. Work had been his own salvation in the months after Thomas's death, the blessed exhaustion that came from physical labor being the only thing that could quiet the voices in his head. But watching Annabelle attack each task with fierce concentration, he wondered if she was running from something more than just painful memories. In the corner of the cabin sat Thomas's unfinished rocking chair, its half-carved arms and incomplete back a testament to dreams interrupted. Elijah had avoided looking at it for 2 years, but now he found his eyes drawn to it whenever Annabelle was near. She'd mentioned it once, running her fingers over the smooth wood with a wistfulness that made his chest ache. He was making this for someone special, she'd said quietly. Maybe. Thomas was always starting projects he never finished. But even as he said it, Elijah knew it wasn't true. The craftsmanship was too careful, too deliberate. Thomas had been carving this chair with love, taking time to smooth each surface and shape each curve with a patience his brother rarely showed for anything else. It was meant for a woman, for a wife, for the family Thomas had dreamed of, but never lived to create. I could finish it, Elijah found himself saying one afternoon as they worked side by side in the small garden plot behind the cabin. Annabel looked up from the bean seeds she was planting. The chair? Thomas would have wanted someone to use it. No point in letting good wood go to waste. She studied his face with those dark eyes that seemed to read his thoughts. Are you sure? Elijah wasn't sure of anything anymore. 2 months ago, his world had been simple grief, solitude, and the endless cycle of seasons marking time until his own death. Now everything was complicated by the presence of a woman who hummed while she worked and left flowers on his table, and made him remember what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. I'm sure, he said that evening, after the day's work was done. Elijah pulled the chair into the firelight and examined Thomas's work with new eyes. His brother had carved morning glories into the back, their trumpet shapes intertwining in a pattern that was both elegant and sturdy. The seat was shaped to cradle a woman's form, the armrests positioned for comfort rather than show. Annabel settled beside him with her ever-present sewing, this time working on a simple dress she was making from fabric they'd bought on their last trip to town. Her presence had transformed even those necessary journeys, turning what had once been grim errands into something approaching pleasant. She charmed the shopkeepers with her soft southern manners and made Elijah see his neighbors through fresh eyes. He was talented, she said, watching him run his hands over the wood grain. Thomas was good with his hands when he put his mind to it, just didn't put his mind to much for very long. Elijah picked up Thomas's carving knife, testing its edge against his thumb. Always said he'd finish this someday. Someday never came. Maybe someday is now. The words carried more weight than they should have, and Elijah found himself looking at her instead of the chair. Annabel kept her eyes on her sewing, but he could see the color rising in her cheeks. Maybe it is, he said quietly. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the whisper of steel against wood and the soft rustle of fabric. Gradually, under Elijah's careful attention, the chair began to take its intended shape. He found himself thinking about Thomas as he worked, not with the sharp grief that had defined the past 2 years, but with something closer to peace. His brother would have liked Annabel, would have appreciated her quick wit and her stubborn determination to find beauty in even the harshest circumstances, would have loved the way she could make a meal from scraps and turn a cold cabin into a warm home with nothing more than her presence and a willingness to care. Tell me about your family, Elijah said, as he smoothed the rough edge with sandpaper Annabel had found in his supplies. Not much to tell that you haven't already heard. Her needle caught the firelight as she pulled thread through fabric. Pape was a good man, but he was broken after Mama died. Started drinking more, taking cases he should have walked away from. I think he was looking for a way to join her. And your grandmother? The one who taught you about healing? Annabel's smile was warm with memory. Grandmother Rose. She was Papa's mother, tough as leather and twice as useful. Lived to be 93 and died in her sleep after tending her garden all day. Said the secret to a long life was staying, too busy to worry about dying. Sounds like a woman worth knowing. She would have liked you. Said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in his willingness to do what needed doing without being asked. Annabel glanced up from her sewing. She would have approved of you finishing that chair, even though it wasn't meant for you. The question slipped out before Elijah could stop it, and immediately he wished he could take it back. They'd been dancing around the growing attraction between them for weeks, neither quite ready to name what was happening, but both aware that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship. Annabel's hands stilled on her fabric. Wasn't it? Thomas carved it for his bride, for the woman he planned to marry, and I'm the woman who came here to marry him. But you didn't. He was already gone. So who does that make me? Annabel set down her sewing and looked directly at him. I'm not Thomas's bride, but I'm not exactly a free woman either. I'm something in between, something without a name. Elijah put down the carving knife and gave her his full attention. You're whatever you choose to be. That's the beauty of this country. Nobody cares who you were back east, only who you decide to become. And who am I becoming? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Elijah could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear of hoping for something that might be taken away. He understood that fear better than she knew. Someone worth staying for, he said simply. Annabel's breath caught, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the flickering firelight. Then she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the chair arm, her fingers warm against his calloused skin. Elijah, she began, then stopped as if unsure how to continue. I know, he said, covering her hand with his. It's complicated. Is it? Or are we making it complicated because we're afraid? The honesty in her voice made something crack open in Elijah's chest. She was right, of course. They were both terrified of wanting something they might lose, of building something that could be destroyed by forces beyond their control. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight, he said. Maybe not. But she didn't move her hand away. The chair is beautiful. Thomas would be proud. It's not finished yet. The best things never are. They just keep growing and changing, becoming more themselves with time. Elijah understood she wasn't talking about the chair anymore. He squeezed her hand gently, a promise and a question all at once. Annabel, he said, then stopped, overwhelmed by everything he wanted to say and couldn't find words for. I know, she whispered, echoing his earlier words. I know. Outside, the wind carried the scent of new grass and melting snow, the promise of warmth after the long cold. Inside the cabin, two people sat by the fire and let themselves believe, for the first time in longer than either could remember, that spring might actually come again. The rocking chair sat between them, no longer a monument to loss, but a symbol of possibility, unfinished, imperfect, but full of potential for the love that would give it meaning. The first real test of their growing bond came on a Tuesday morning when Annabel woke screaming. Elijah bolted upright from his bedroll by the fire, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he kept within arm's reach. In the gray pre-dawn light, he could see Annabel thrashing on Thomas's old bed, her face twisted with terror as she fought some invisible enemy. No, she gasped, her voice raw with panic. Please, I'll do anything. Don't hurt them. Don't, Annabel. Elijah crossed to her side, but stopped short of touching her, knowing from experience that waking someone from a nightmare too abruptly could be dangerous. Annabel, you're safe. You're in Wyoming, in my cabin. It's just a dream. Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she stared at him as if he were a stranger, her breathing rapid and shallow. Then recognition dawned, and she collapsed back against the pillow with a shuddering sob. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize. Elijah sat carefully on the edge of the bed, near enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to give her space. Bad dream? Annabel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You could say that. She struggled to sit up, pushing damp hair back from her face. It was so real. I could smell the smoke, hear the screaming ... Want to talk about it? She was quiet for so long that Elijah thought she might refuse. Then she drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small in a way that broke his heart. There was a fire, she said finally. Back in Georgia, just before I left. Cassidy. He burned down a church where some of the freed slaves had been meeting. Said they were getting too uppity, thinking they had the same rights as white folks. Elijah felt ice forming in his veins. Were you there? Close enough to see it happen. Close enough to hear ... double quotes. She shuddered. There were children inside. Families who thought they were safe because it was God's house. Her voice dropped too, a whisper. I tried to help, but Cassidy saw me. Told me if I ever spoke about what I'd witnessed, he'd make sure I joined them. The pieces of Annabelle's story were starting to form a picture that made Elijah sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage, or even escaping death. This was about someone who'd witnessed unspeakable evil and been marked for silence. That's when you decided to leave? That's when I knew I had no choice. Papa was already gone by then, drank himself to death rather than face what was happening. In our town, I was alone, and Cassidy was making it clear that my options were limited. Annabelle looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge of human cruelty. When he offered me passage west to marry Thomas, I thought it was a miracle, a way out that wouldn't require me to compromise myself. But it was a trap, the perfect trap. Get the inconvenient witness far away from anyone who might believe her story, then make sure she disappears permanently in the wilderness, where nobody would ever find her body. Her hand went to her throat, touching the wooden cross. I played right into his hands. Elijah wanted to reach for her, to offer physical comfort, but something in her posture warned him off. She was holding herself together through sheer force of will, and any kindness might shatter the careful control she'd built around her pain. "He won't find you here," Elijah said instead. "You don't know him. He's patient, and he's smart, and he has resources most people can only dream of." Annabelle's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd learned not to hope for rescue. "He'll keep looking until he finds me, and when he does ... When he does, he'll have to go through me first." The words came out harder than Elijah had intended, edged with a violence that surprised them both. He'd spent 2 years learning to live with loss, teaching himself not to care too much about anything that could be taken away. But the thought of anyone hurting Annabelle awakened something primitive and protective in his chest. "You don't understand," Annabelle said. "This isn't just one man. Cassidy has connections, people who owe him favors. He can make you disappear just as easily as me. Then we'll be ready for him." "How?" "You're one man with a rifle and good intentions. He's got an army of people who'd sell their souls for the right price." Elijah stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a piece of paper that had been hidden under a stack of bills. It was torn and stained, but the writing was still legible enough to make out key details. He'd found it the day before while cleaning out Thomas's old trunk, apparently dropped and forgotten among his brother's possessions. "What's this?" Annabelle asked as he handed it to her. "Something I found in Thomas's things. Look at the name at the bottom." Annabelle squinted at the faded ink, then went very still. "Cassidy," she breathed. "But this is ... This is a wanted poster for cattle rustling and murder, dated 3 years ago. Your friend Cassidy has been a busy man for longer than you know." Elijah sat back down, his mind working through the implications. Thomas was always good at collecting information, especially about men who might pose a threat to the homestead. He must have gotten this somewhere and kept it for insurance. But if there's already a warrant out for him, then we're not as alone as we thought. Men with prices on their heads tend to make enemies, and enemies can become allies if you know how to find them. Elijah took the poster back, studying the faded description. "The question is whether Cassidy knows Thomas had this." Annabelle's face went pale. "You think that's why Thomas died? Not from fever, but because of what he knew?" The possibility had been growing in Elijah's mind ever since he'd found the poster, explaining things that had never quite made sense about his brother's death. Thomas had been healthy as a horse right up until that final week, when he'd suddenly taken ill with symptoms that seemed more like poisoning than any natural disease. "I think," Elijah said carefully, "that we need to be very careful about who we trust. And in the meantime, we prepare. I'll teach you to shoot, and we'll work out signals and escape routes. If Cassidy comes looking, we'll be ready for him." Annabelle stared at the poster, her hands trembling slightly. "I never wanted anyone else to get hurt because of me." "You didn't cause this?" "Cassidy did, the moment he decided that his comfort was worth more than other people's lives." Elijah reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "You're not responsible for his choices, but you are responsible for your own. The question is, are you going to let him win, or are you going to fight back?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Outside, the first birds of morning were beginning to sing, and pale light was starting to filter through the cabin's single window. The day was beginning, bringing with it all the ordinary tasks that made up a life feeding animals, tending gardens, mending what was broken. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. They were no longer just two lonely people sharing space and slowly learning to trust each other. They were partners in something larger and more dangerous, bound together by secrets and threats, and the growing certainty that their fates were intertwined. "Teach me," Annabelle said finally, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Teach me everything I need to know to survive." Elijah nodded, feeling something settle into place in his chest. "We'll start today." As the sun rose over the Wyoming mountains, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, two people began planning for a war they hadn't chosen, but were determined to win. The innocence of their early days together was gone, replaced by something harder and more durable, the kind of partnership forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. Neither of them spoke of love that morning, but it was there in the careful way they planned for each other's safety, in the trust that passed between them like a promise, in the quiet determination to protect what they'd found together against anyone who would try to take it away. The shooting lessons began that very afternoon in a clearing behind the cabin, where the sound wouldn't carry to any unwanted ears. Elijah had fashioned targets from empty cans and pieces of scrap wood, arranging them at varying distances to simulate the chaos of a real confrontation. "The most important thing," he said, placing his old Colt .45 in Annabelle's hands, "is not to be afraid of the gun. It's a tool, nothing more. Respect it, but don't fear it." Annabelle hefted the weapon, testing its weight. Her hands were steady, but Elijah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow. "It's heavier than I expected," she said. "That's good. Means it won't jump around when you fire it. Now, let's start with the basics." For the next hour, Elijah walked her through the fundamentals: how to load and unload, how to clean the weapon, how to sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger without jerking. Annabelle proved to be a surprisingly quick study, her movements becoming more confident with each repetition. "You've done this before," Elijah observed after she put 3 shots in a row into the center of a can at 20 paces. "Grandmother Rose taught me. Said a woman alone in the world needed to know how to protect herself." Annabelle's mouth quirked in a small smile. "Course, she used an old musket that kicked like a mule. This is much easier." "Your grandmother sounds like she was quite a woman." "She was. Used to say that the good Lord gave us hands to work and brains to think, but sometimes you needed steel to make sure other folks respected your choices." Annabelle reloaded with practiced efficiency. "Papa never approved of her teaching me to shoot. Said it wasn't ladylike." "What do you say?" "I say being dead isn't very ladylike either." That evening, as they cleaned the weapons and stored them safely away, Annabelle surprised Elijah by asking about Thomas's other possessions. "You said you found that wanted poster in his trunk. What else was in there?" Elijah hesitated. He'd been avoiding Thomas's trunk for 2 years, unable to face the intimate details of his brother's life. But Annabelle's question made him realize that his reluctance might have cost them valuable information. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't really gone through everything." "Maybe we should." The trunk sat in the corner of the cabin like a coffin, its brass corners tarnished and its leather straps cracked with age. Thomas had brought it west with him, carrying what little remained of their childhood in Ohio. Opening it felt like disturbing, A grave, but Elijah forced himself to lift the heavy lid. The smell hit him first tobacco and leather, and the faint scent of the cologne Thomas had favored for special occasions. Beneath that lay the more painful aroma of memory, the particular combination of scents that had belonged uniquely to his brother. "Take your time," Annabel said softly. Settling beside him on the floor. The trunk contained the usual accumulation of a life-old clothes. A few books, a harmonica Thomas had never learned to play properly. But as they dug deeper, they began to find things that painted a different picture of Thomas's final years. Letters, for one thing. Not the fake correspondence that had lured Annabel West, but real letters in Thomas's own hand, addressed to people Elijah had never heard of. Most were never sent, apparently drafted and then abandoned as if Thomas had lost his nerve. "Listen to this," Annabel said, unfolding one of the pages. "Dear Marshal Williams, I am writing to inform you of suspicious activities in our territory that may be of interest to federal authorities." She looked up at Elijah. "Your brother was corresponding with a U.S. Marshal?" "News to me." Elijah took the letter, scanning Thomas's familiar scrawl. "But it makes sense. Thomas always had a strong sense of right and wrong, even when it got him into trouble. There's more." Annabel held up another bundle of papers, these tied with a red ribbon that looked newer than the rest. "These are all addressed to someone named Cassidy." Elijah felt his blood turn to ice. "Let me see those." The letters were different from Thomas's other correspondence, more formal, more careful. They read like business communications, but the business they discussed made Elijah's skin crawl. "Mr. Cassidy," he read aloud, "I have reconsidered your offer and find myself unable to accept the terms as previously discussed. My conscience will not permit me to participate in activities that harm innocent people, regardless of the financial compensation involved." He was trying to back out of something, Annabel said. Something bad enough that he felt the need to put his refusal in writing. Elijah shuffled through the other letters, each one more adamant than the last. "Look at this one. Sir, your threats do not concern me. I have taken precautions to ensure that if anything happens to me, certain information will reach the appropriate authorities. Consider this my final communication on the matter." They stared at each other across the pile of papers, the implications settling over them like a cold fog. Thomas hadn't died of fever. He'd been murdered for refusing to cooperate with Cassidy's schemes and threatening to expose them. "The precautions he mentioned," Annabel said quietly. "Do you think? The wanted poster. Maybe other evidence, hidden somewhere Cassidy couldn't find it." Elijah stood and began pacing the small cabin. Thomas was careful about important things, methodical. If he was gathering evidence against Cassidy, he'd have made sure it was well hidden. But where? Elijah stopped pacing and looked around the cabin with new eyes. Where would Thomas hide something he wanted to keep safe but accessible? Somewhere Elijah would eventually find it, but not somewhere obvious enough for strangers to discover by accident. His gaze fell on the unfinished rocking chair. "Help me turn this over," he said, moving toward the chair. Together, they carefully inverted the piece of furniture, exposing the underside of the seat. At first, Elijah saw nothing unusual. Then Annabel pointed to a section where the wood grain looked slightly different. "There," she said. "That piece doesn't match the rest." Elijah ran his fingers over the area and felt the slight give of a loose board. With careful pressure, he was able to slide the piece aside, revealing a hollow space carved into the chair's frame. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small bundle. "Love letters," Annabel said with dark humor as Elijah unwrapped the package. But these weren't love letters. They were copies of correspondence between Cassidy and various accomplices, detailing a network of corruption that stretched from Georgia to the Wyoming Territory. There were bills of sale for stolen cattle, agreements to intimidate witnesses, and most damning of all, a detailed plan to eliminate troublesome elements that threatened their operation. Thomas's name was on the list. So was Annabel's. Sweet Mother of God, Annabel whispered, reading over his shoulder. He's been planning this for months. The whole mail-order bride scheme, bringing me west, even your brother's death, it's all here. Elijah's hands shook as he read the final document in the bundle, a letter from Cassidy to someone identified only as the sheriff, detailing plans to claim the Boone homestead after eliminating both brothers and making it look like an Indian raid. We have to get this to the authorities, Annabel said. Which authorities? For all we know, this sheriff he's writing to is the one we'd be turning the evidence over to. Elijah carefully rewrapped the documents. We need to be smart about this. What do you suggest? First, we make copies. Then we figure out who we can trust. Elijah looked at her seriously. This changes everything, Annabel. We're not just hiding from one corrupt man anymore. We're up against an entire network, and they think we're already dead, don't they? The plan was for me to disappear in the wilderness, and for you to be killed in that fake Indian raid, which means we have an advantage they don't know about. They think they've won, that their secrets are safe. Elijah smiled grimly. Time to prove them wrong. As they carefully restored the chair to its original position, hiding the evidence back in its secret compartment, both of them understood that their quiet courtship was over. They were no longer two people falling in love in the wilderness. They were soldiers in a war against corruption, bound together by shared danger and a common enemy. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising another harsh night. But inside the cabin, two people sat down to plan a campaign that would either bring justice to the Wyoming Territory or get them both killed in the attempt. Either way, they would face it together. The sound of hoofbeats on the morning air brought both Elijah and Annabel to their feet, hands instinctively moving toward the weapons they now kept within easy reach. Through the cabin's single window, they could see a lone rider approaching. At a steady pace, too deliberate to be friendly, and too slow to be an immediate threat. Stay inside, Elijah murmured, checking the load in his rifle. Keep the back door clear in case we need to run. But as the rider drew closer, Elijah felt his blood turn to ice. The man was tall and dark-haired, dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and power. More troubling still was the way he sat, his horse confident, relaxed, like a man who owned whatever ground his animal's hooves touched. Cassidy, Annabel breathed from behind him, her voice barely a whisper. The man dismounted with leisurely grace, taking his time to tie his horse to the hitching post Thomas had built years ago. When he turned toward the cabin, Elijah got his first clear look at the face that had haunted Annabel's nightmares. Cassidy was younger than Elijah had expected, probably not yet 40, with the kind of handsome features that would make women trust him and men want to buy him drinks. His smile was warm and friendly as he approached the cabin, his hands held carefully away from the gun at his hip. "Morning," he called out in a voice that carried the educated accents of the East. "I'm looking for Elijah Boone. Got some business to discuss with him." Elijah stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready but not quite aimed. "You found him. State your business. Name's Cassidy." "Sheriff Cassidy, actually." The man reached into his coat with deliberate slowness and produced a badge that caught the morning sunlight. "I'm here about a woman who went missing from my jurisdiction. Young lady by the name of Annabel Hart." The badge hit Elijah like a physical blow, not just because it meant Cassidy had legal authority to back up his threats, but because of what it revealed about the scope of the corruption they were fighting. This wasn't just a criminal with connections. This was the law itself turned against innocent people. "Don't know anyone by that name," Elijah said, proud of how steady his voice sounded. "That's strange, seeing as how she was supposed to arrive here several months ago to marry your deceased brother." Cassidy's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I have correspondence indicating she was traveling to this exact homestead. Lot of people travel through the territory. Most don't stop here. I'm sure they don't. Cassidy took a step closer to the porch. Mind if I come inside? Long ride from town, and I could use some coffee while we discuss this situation. Every instinct Elijah possessed screamed danger, but refusing would only confirm Cassidy's suspicions. Coffee's not much, but you're welcome to it. As Cassidy climbed the porch steps, Elijah caught sight of Annabelle pressed against the wall. Beside the door, a pistol in her hands and terror written across her face. Their eyes met for just an instant, and he saw her gather herself for whatever was coming. Inside the cabin, Cassidy made a show of examining his surroundings with the casual interest of a lawman conducting routine business. But Elijah noticed how his gaze lingered on details that would tell a story. The second cup beside the coffee pot, the woman's clothes hanging on pegs beside the door, the unmistakable signs that this bachelor cabin was being shared. Nice place, Cassidy said, settling into one of the rough wooden chairs. Your brother fix it up before he passed? Some. Thomas was handy with tools when the mood struck him. Shame about his death. Fever, wasn't it? That's right. Funny thing about fever, Cassidy mused, accepting the cup of coffee Elijah poured for him. Sometimes it strikes the healthiest folks without warning, almost like they were poisoned instead of sick. The words were delivered with casual ease, but their meaning was clear as a gunshot. Cassidy was admitting to Thomas's murder, confident that Elijah couldn't do anything about it. Thomas was always sickly, Elijah lied. Surprised it didn't take him sooner, was he now? Because I heard tell he was strong as an ox, right up until that last week. Cassidy sipped his coffee and smiled. Course, people do love to exaggerate when they're telling stories about the dead. Behind Cassidy's back, Elijah saw Annabelle edge closer to the window, positioning herself for a clear shot if needed. Her face was pale but determined, and he felt a surge of fierce pride at her courage. So about this missing woman, Cassidy continued. Annabelle Hart, pretty little thing, if the descriptions I have are accurate. Dark hair, brown eyes, speaks with a Georgia accent. Someone matching that description was seen in the area around the time she disappeared. Territory's full of women. Can't keep track of them all. But you'd remember this one. She was carrying a letter addressed to your brother, supposedly arranging a marriage between them. Cassidy's eyes were fixed on Elijah's face, watching for any telltale reaction. Course, since your brother was already dead, that marriage would have been impossible to arrange. Maybe whoever wrote the letter didn't know Thomas had passed. Maybe. Or maybe someone was using that letter to lure a young woman into a dangerous situation. Cassidy stood and began walking around the cabin, his movements casual, but his attention sharp. See, Miss Hart witnessed something back in Georgia that she shouldn't have seen. Something that could cause considerable trouble for certain parties if it ever became public knowledge. And you think she's here? I think she's somewhere in this territory, and I think you know where. Cassidy stopped beside the unfinished rocking chair, running his hand over the carved wood. This is beautiful work. Your brother make this? Started. It never finished. Shame. Would have made a lovely piece for a wife. Cassidy's fingers traced the morning glory pattern, and Elijah held his breath, praying the man wouldn't discover the hidden compartment. Tell me, Mr. Boone, what do you know about your brother's business dealings in his final months? Thomas kept his own counsel about most things. Did he now? Because I have reason to believe he was involved in some activities that might interest federal authorities. Cattle rustling, for instance. Maybe some other unpleasant business. Elijah felt anger flare in his chest. Even in death, Thomas was being slandered by this corrupt lawman who'd murdered him for refusing to participate in crimes. Thomas was many things, but he wasn't a thief. Funny you should say that, because I have evidence suggesting otherwise. Cassidy reached into his coat again, this time producing a sheaf of papers. Bills of sale, correspondence, witness statements, all pointing to a conspiracy involving your brother and several other men in this territory. Elijah recognized the documents. They were forgeries, clever ones designed to frame Thomas posthumously and justify whatever action Cassidy planned to take against the homestead. Even if that were true, Elijah said carefully, Thomas is dead. Whatever he might have done died with him. But his property didn't, and neither did his associates. Cassidy folded the papers and tucked them away. I'm authorized to seize this homestead as proceeds from criminal activity. Unless, of course, you can provide information that might help my investigation. What kind of information? The whereabouts of Annabel Hart, for starters. And any evidence your brother might have left behind regarding his criminal activities. There it was, the real reason for this visit. Cassidy wasn't just hunting Annabel. He was also looking for the evidence Thomas had gathered against him. Evidence that was hidden less than 10 feet from where the corrupt sheriff stood. Like I said, I don't know any Annabel Hart, and if Thomas was involved in anything illegal, he kept it to himself. Cassidy studied Elijah's face for a long moment, then smiled the kind of smile a cat might give a mouse. You know what I think, Mr. Boone. I think you're lying to me. I think Miss Hart is here, probably hiding somewhere close by. And I think you know exactly where your brother hid the evidence he was gathering against certain parties. Think whatever you like. Doesn't make it true. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what I can prove in court. Cassidy's hand drifted toward his gun. And as the duly appointed sheriff of this county, I have broad authority to investigate suspected criminal activity. The threat was clear, and Elijah found himself calculating distances and angles, wondering if he could get to his rifle before Cassidy could draw his sidearm. But before he could move, Annabel stepped out from behind the door, her pistol trained on the sheriff's back. I wouldn't, she said quietly. Cassidy froze, his hand inches from his gun. Well, well. Miss Annabel Hart, I presume. You presume correctly. I have to say, you're even prettier than your description suggested. That's going to make this easier? Make what easier? Cassidy turned slowly, his hands now raised, but his expression still confident. Why, arresting you for the murder of Thomas. Boone, of course. Self-defense won't work as a plea when everyone knows you never met the man before you killed him. Elijah felt the world tilt sideways. What are you talking about? Miss Hart arrived here planning to marry your brother, found out he was already dead, and killed him in a rage when she realized she'd been deceived. Then she seduced you into helping her cover up the crime. Cassidy's smile was triumphant. It's a compelling story, and I have witnesses who'll swear to every word of it. Thomas died of fever. There were witnesses to his illness. Witnesses who can be convinced to remember things differently, given the right incentive. Cassidy's badge caught the light as he shifted position. Amazing how flexible people's memories can be when their own freedom is at stake. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. Not only had Cassidy murdered Thomas and framed him posthumously for cattle rustling, but he was prepared to blame the murder on Annabel and use his authority as sheriff to make the charges stick. You can't prove any of this, Annabel said, but Elijah could hear the fear creeping into her voice. I don't have to prove it. I just have to convince a jury, and juries tend to believe sheriffs over pretty young women with mysterious pasts. Cassidy took a step toward her. Now, why don't you put down that gun before someone gets hurt? The only one getting hurt is you if you take another step. Miss Hart, I'm a duly sworn officer of the law. Shooting me would be murder, and Mr. Boone here would be an accessory to that murder. Is that really what you want? Elijah saw the doubt flicker across Annabel's face and knew that Cassidy had found her weakness. She was brave enough to fight. For her own life, but not ruthless enough to destroy someone else's in the process. There's another option, Cassidy continued, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. You come with me willingly. Testify that Thomas Boone was involved in cattle rustling, and I'll make sure Mr. Boone here isn't charged as an accessory to your crimes. He'll lose the homestead, of course, but he'll keep his freedom. And what happens to me? Well, that depends on how cooperative you are. A woman with your particular skills could be very useful to the right people. You might find the arrangement quite comfortable, assuming you don't cause any more trouble. The meaning was clear, and Elijah felt rage boil up inside him like molten steel. This bastard was offering to spare his life in exchange for Annabel's slavery, confident that fear would make them both accept his terms. But Cassidy had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Elijah was the same broken man who'd spent 2 years grieving alone in this cabin. He didn't understand that love had given Elijah something to fight for again, something worth dying for, if necessary. "Counteroffer," Elijah said quietly. "I'm listening. You get back on your horse and ride out of here. Never come back, never bother us again. In exchange, you get to keep breathing." Cassidy laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Mr. Boone, you're hardly in a position to make threats. I'm a sheriff with a badge and legal authority. You're a suspected accomplice to murder. And you're a corrupt son of a bitch who killed my brother." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly the pretense of civility evaporated. Cassidy's hand moved toward his gun with practiced speed, but Elijah was already moving, throwing himself sideways as the sheriff's pistol cleared leather. The cabin exploded into violence and gunsmoke, the final confrontation beginning with the crash of splintering wood and the deadly whisper of bullets seeking flesh. The gunshot shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass, and for a heartbeat that lasted forever, Elijah thought he was dead. Then he hit the floor hard, splinters from the wooden wall stinging his face as Cassidy's bullet passed through. The space where his head had been, Annabel's pistol roared in response, the sound deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Cassidy dove sideways, overturning the table and sending coffee cups crashing to the floor. He came up behind Thomas's old bed, his own weapon tracking toward Annabel with deadly precision. "Don't move," Elijah shouted, rolling toward his rifle, propped against the far wall. Another shot from Cassidy splintered the floorboards inches from his hand, and he threw himself behind the cast-iron stove. "You're only making this harder on yourselves," Cassidy called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I've got deputies on the way, and when they get here, this becomes a lot more complicated for everyone." Elijah caught Annabel's eye across the smoke-filled cabin and saw his own thoughts reflected there. If Cassidy really did have backup coming, they needed to end this quickly or find a way to escape. Fighting corrupt lawmen was one thing. Fighting an entire posse was suicide. How long? Annabel mouthed silently. Elijah held up his hand, fingers spread. 5 minutes, maybe less. Enough time to grab the evidence from the rocking chair and make a run for it. If they could keep Cassidy pinned down, but the corrupt sheriff had other ideas. Another shot punched through the cabin wall near Annabel's position, forcing her to scramble for better cover. Cassidy was trying to drive them toward the back of the cabin, away from both the evidence and their best escape route. "You know what's funny?" Cassidy's voice carried an edge of amusement that made Elijah's skin crawl. "Your brother thought he was so clever, gathering evidence against me. Took me months to figure out where he'd hidden it all." Elijah's blood ran cold. If Cassidy knew about the evidence... "Oh yes, I know about your little discovery." "Did you really? Think Thomas was the only one who could carve a hiding place in furniture?" Another shot, this one aimed deliberately at the rocking chair. Wood exploded as the bullet tore through the seat, and Elijah heard the distinctive sound of paper scattering. There. Evidence. Their one chance to expose Cassidy's crimes and clear their own names. Gone in a spray of splinters and gunsmoke. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Elijah remembered something Thomas had taught him during their early days in the territory. When the odds are against you, change the game. "Cannibal," he called out, hoping she would understand. The lamp, for a moment, Confusion flickered across her face. Then understanding dawned, and she nodded grimly. The cabin's single oil lamp sat on a shelf near the door, within reach, if it. She could get to it without exposing herself to Cassidy's line of fire. "You're running out of time," Cassidy warned. "My men will be here soon, and when they arrive, this becomes a matter of 3 outlaws resisting arrest. The territorial judge won't waste much time on a trial." "3 outlaws?" Elijah asked, genuinely confused. "You, Miss Hart, and your mysterious accomplice who's been helping you hide the evidence." Amazing how criminals always seem to multiply when you start investigating them properly. The bastard was planning to claim there was a 3rd person involved. Someone who could be blamed for any inconvenient evidence that might surface later. It was a perfect frame job, designed to discredit anything that might threaten his operation. Elijah heard the distant sound of hoofbeats and knew their time was running out. In another few minutes, the cabin would be surrounded by armed men wearing badges, and their chances of survival would drop to 0. "Now," he whispered. Hannibal moved like lightning, diving toward the lamp while Elijah provided covering fire. Cassidy's attention shifted toward her, giving Elijah the opening he needed to reach his rifle. The weapon felt solid and familiar in his hands, a tool he'd used to hunt game and protect livestock for 15 years. Now he was hunting something far more dangerous. The lamp shattered against the cabin's back wall, oil spreading across the dry wood in a dark stain that would ignite like tinder. Hannibal struck a match and tossed it into the spreading pool, flames leaping to life with hungry enthusiasm. "You're making a mistake," Cassidy snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Fire was the one thing every frontier dweller feared above all else. It could spread faster than a man could run, and showed no mercy to anyone caught in its path. "Maybe," Elijah replied, levering a round into the chamber. "But it's our mistake to make." The flames spread quickly across the oil-soaked wood, filling the cabin with smoke and orange light. Cassidy would have to choose between staying to finish them off and escaping before the fire trapped him inside. And with his backup approaching, he couldn't afford to be caught in a burning building with 2 supposedly dead bodies. "This isn't over," Cassidy shouted over the crackling flames. "You can burn this place down, but you can't hide forever. I'll find you, and when I do, you'll wish you'd taken my generous offer." A window exploded outward as Cassidy made his escape, glass and wood fragments scattering across the ground outside. Elijah heard cursing and the sound of boots running toward the front of the cabin, then hoofbeats as the corrupt sheriff mounted his horse. "The evidence," Hannibal said, staring at the scattered papers around the destroyed rocking chair. "Leave it." Elijah grabbed their emergency supplies, the pack they prepared for exactly this situation, and pulled her toward the back door. "We have what we need, but without proof, we'll find another way." The flames were spreading, faster now, licking at the walls and ceiling with increasing hunger. "Right now, we need to get out of here before his friends arrive." They burst through the back door just as the sound of approaching horses grew loud enough to count. 4 riders, maybe 5, coming fast from the direction of town. Elijah grabbed Hannibal's hand and pulled her toward the tree line behind the cabin. "The horses," she protested. "Already gone. Cassidy ran them off while we were busy shooting at each other." Elijah had seen his animals scattering when the gunfire started, spooked beyond any hope of quick recovery. "We go on foot, or we don't go at all." They reached the trees just as the first of Cassidy's men came around the cabin. Shouts erupted as the deputies saw the fire, followed by more cursing as they realized their quarry had escaped. Through the smoke and flames, Elijah could see Cassidy gesturing angrily, pointing toward the forest where they'd disappeared. "Spread out," the corrupt sheriff bellowed. "They can't have gotten far on foot. And remember, these are dangerous. Criminals who've already killed one man. Shoot first and ask questions later." Elijah felt Annabelle's hand tighten in his as they heard the unmistakable sound of a manhunt being organized. Within minutes, armed men would be combing these woods, following their trail with the patience and persistence of professional hunters. "Where do we go?" Annabel whispered. Elijah had been asking himself the same question. They had no horses, limited supplies, and winter was still weeks away from loosening its grip on the high country. Worse, they were now fugitives from the Yums, law unable to seek help from anyone who might recognize them. But Thomas had taught him something else during their early years in the territory. When you can't go forward and you can't go back, go up. "The old mine," Elijah said, remembering the abandoned silver workings in the mountains above their homestead. "It's defensible, and there's water nearby. We can hold out there while we figure out our next move. And then what? Then we find a way to expose Cassidy for what he really is." Elijah looked back at his burning cabin, watching 15 years of his life disappear in smoke and flame. Thomas gathered evidence once. "We can do it again. Without proof, it's just our word against. A sheriff's badge. Then we'll have to make sure our word carries more weight." Elijah shouldered their pack and started climbing, following deer trails he'd learned as a young man. "Come on, we've got a war to plan." Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, taking with it the last remnants of the quiet life they'd been building together. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Cassidy had made this personal when he murdered Thomas. He'd made it a crusade when he'd tried to enslave Annabel. Now he'd made it a war by burning down everything Elijah had worked to build. It was a war the corrupt sheriff was going to regret starting. The old mine shaft gaped like a wound in the mountainside, its entrance partially concealed by deadfall and decades of neglect. Elijah had explored it as a younger man, back when he'd harbored dreams of striking it rich in the silver veins that ran through these mountains. The mine had yielded nothing but disappointment then, but now it offered something more valuable than precious metal: sanctuary. How deep does it go? Annabel asked as they paused at the entrance to catch their breath. "Deep enough. There's a chamber about 50 feet, and that's dry and defensible. Only one way in or out, which makes it easy to guard, but hard to escape from if we're cornered." "Sounds like we're betting everything on not being found." "We're betting everything on being ready when we are found." Elijah checked his rifle one more time, counting the remaining ammunition. "Because one way or another, this ends here." As they disappeared into the darkness of the mine, the sound of pursuit grew fainter, but never stopped entirely. Somewhere below them, Cassidy and his men were following their trail with the methodical patience of professional manhunters. The final confrontation was coming, and both sides knew it would determine not just who lived or died, but what kind of justice would prevail in this harsh and unforgiving land. The mine chamber opened up like the inside of a cathedral, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that their small fire couldn't penetrate. Ancient tool marks scarred the walls where long-dead miners had chased veins of silver into the mountains. Heart, and the air carried the metallic taste of old dreams and abandoned hopes. Elijah arranged their meager supplies, while Annabel worked to make the space livable, her movements efficient despite the exhaustion that lined her face. They had perhaps 2 days' worth of food and water, enough to outlast a casual search, but nowhere near sufficient for a prolonged siege. "They'll find us," Annabel said quietly, voicing what they both knew. "It's just a matter of time." "I know." Elijah checked the action on his rifle, the weapon Thomas had hidden away for emergencies just like this one. "The question is whether we'll be ready when they do." Through the mine entrance, they could hear the distant sounds of the searchmen calling to each other, horses picking their way carefully up the rocky slopes, the occasional gunshot as someone jumped at shadows. Cassidy was being thorough, systematically working his way up the mountain with the patience of a man who knew his quarry had nowhere else to run. "Tell me about the mine," Annabel said, settling beside the small fire they'd built in a natural depression in the stone floor. How many ways in or out? Just the one we came through, as far as I know. These shafts were dug to follow the silver veins, not for tactical advantage. Elijah pointed deeper into the darkness. There might be other passages further back, but most of them probably collapsed years ago. So we're trapped. Or they are, depending on how you look at it. Elijah moved to the chamber entrance and peered out into the gathering dusk. Cassidy can't afford to wait us out. He's got a story to maintain back in town, and the longer this takes, the more questions people will start asking. What kind of questions? The kind that might make folks wonder why a sheriff would burn down a homestead to catch two supposedly dangerous criminals. Or why those criminals chose to run toward the mountains instead of heading for the territorial border. Elijah turned back to face her. Cassidy's playing a dangerous game. The more violence he uses, the more attention he attracts. So what does that mean for us? It means he'll come for us soon, probably at dawn when he can see to shoot straight. And he'll come hard, planning to end this quickly and decisively. They spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing for the assault they both knew was coming. Elijah showed Annabel how to create a makeshift barricade using loose stones and mining equipment, positioning their defenses to force any attackers into a narrow corridor where superior numbers wouldn't matter as much. You don't have to be part of this, he said as they worked. There's still time for you to slip out the back passages. Try to make it to the territorial capital. Tell your story to someone who might listen. Annabel paused in her work and looked at him with those dark eyes that had haunted his. Dreamed since the night he'd found her in the storm. Is that what you want me to do? I want you to live. Whatever else happens, I want you to have a chance at the life you came west to find. The life I came west to find was a lie, remember? Everything about it was built on deception and false promises. She returned to stacking stones, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. The only real thing I've found in this territory is what we've built together. Annabel, no. She turned to face him fully, and he was struck by the fierce determination in her expression. I've spent my whole life running from one bad situation to another, always hoping someone else would solve my problems. I'm done running. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. Cassidy murdered your brother, burned our home, and plans to frame us for crimes we didn't commit. If that's not my fight, then what is? Elijah felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart to protect it from further loss. Looking at this remarkable woman, dirty, exhausted, and facing almost certain death, but still ready to stand and fight for what was right, he realized that Thomas's death hadn't ended his capacity to love. It had simply hidden it until someone worth loving came along. In that case, he said quietly, we'd better make sure we win. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they took turns keeping watch while the other tried to rest. Elijah found sleep impossible, his mind running through tactical scenarios and worst-case possibilities. Every sound from outside the mine made him reach for his weapon. Every shift in the wind bringing the possibility of discovery near midnight. Annabel woke from a restless doze and found him staring into the dying embers of their fire. Can't sleep either? She asked. Too much to think about. She moved closer, settling beside him in the circle of fading warmth. What are you thinking about? Thomas, mostly. Wondering if he'd approve of what we're doing. What do you think he'd say? Elijah considered the question seriously. His brother had been many things: reckless, charming, frustratingly optimistic, but he'd also possessed an unshakable sense of right and wrong that had ultimately cost him his life. He'd probably say we're both crazy for taking on a corrupt sheriff and his whole organization. Elijah smiled despite their circumstances. Then he'd ask if we needed help reloading. Sounds like a good man. He was. Not perfect, but good where it counted. Elijah looked at her in the flickering firelight. You would have liked each other. Maybe, but I'm glad things worked out the way they did. The admission hung between them like a bridge, and, for a moment, Elijah forgot about the danger surrounding them, the impossible odds they faced, the likelihood that dawn would bring their deaths. All that mattered was the woman sitting beside him, the warmth of her presence, and the courage that had brought her to this dark place. "Annabel," he said, then stopped, overwhelmed by everything he wanted to tell her, and the possibility that he might not get another chance. "I know," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face. "I know." They kissed then, gentle and desperate at the same time, a promise made in the shadow of violence and death. When they finally broke apart, Elijah could see tears on her cheeks, silver tracks in the firelight. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he began. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Her voice was steady despite the tears. "No more running, no more hiding. We make our stand here, even if it means dying, especially if it means dying, because some things are worth dying for, and this what we found together, this is one of them." Dawn came pale and cold, seeping into the mine entrance like smoke. With it came the sound they'd been dreading, the careful footsteps of men, positioning themselves outside, the metallic click of weapons being checked and loaded. Boom! Cassidy's voice echoed off the stone walls, amplified and distorted by the mine's acoustics. "Time to end this charade. You're surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. Come out now, and I promise you a fair trial." Elijah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A fair trial from the man who'd murdered his brother and burned down their home? The same man who'd already written their obituaries in his mind? "Counter-offer," Elijah called back. "You and your boys ride away now, and I promise not to kill all of you. That's not going to happen. You've got 5 minutes to surrender, or we're coming in after you." Elijah looked at Annabel, crouched behind their makeshift barricade with Thomas's old pistol in her hands. Her face was calm, resolved, beautiful, even in the dim light of the mine. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he wanted that face to be the last thing he saw. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." Outside, Cassidy was giving orders to his men, deploying them for the assault that would either end their rebellion or begin. A legend. Either way, it would be decided with bullets and blood, in the darkness of an abandoned mine where dreams had once died, and now might be reborn. The final confrontation was about to begin. The first shots came without warning, muzzle flashes lighting up the mine entrance like lightning in a storm. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls with deadly whines, filling the air with chips of rock and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Elijah pressed himself against the barricade, waiting for the initial barrage to end before returning fire. "Stay down," he called to Annabel as lead slugs sparked off the stones above their heads. But she was already moving, using the cover they'd built to angle for a better position. Her first shot took one of Cassidy's deputies in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back down the slope outside the mine. The man's scream echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that seemed to pause the assault for a heartbeat. "Nice shooting," Elijah said, levering another round into his rifle. "Grandmother Rose always said to aim for center mass," Annabel replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "But sometimes you take what you can get." The attack resumed with renewed fury, Cassidy's remaining men pressing forward, despite the defensive advantage their quarry held. Through the smoke and confusion, Elijah could hear the corrupt sheriff shouting orders, his voice tight with rage. At the unexpected resistance, "Rush them. They can't have much ammunition left." But Cassidy had underestimated both their preparation and their determination. Thomas's rifle held true with each shot, and Annabel's pistol work kept the attackers honest, forcing them to take cover instead of charging blindly into the mine shaft. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm advance and retreat, shot and countershot, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Minutes stretched like hours in the confined space, each muzzle flash revealing desperate faces and blood-stained stone. Then Elijah heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of men moving around to the sides of the mine entrance, trying to flank their position. "They're splitting up," he told Annabel, recognizing the tactics. "Cassidy's keeping us busy while his men look for another way in." "I thought you said it was only one entrance." "Only one I know about. But these old mines sometimes connect to each other through passages the original miners forgot to map." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed from the deeper recesses of the mine's slow, careful movement in the darkness behind them. They were about to be caught between two forces, trapped in the crossfire with nowhere to run. "We need to move," Elijah said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The footsteps were getting closer, and the men at the entrance were pressing forward again, sensing victory within reach. That's when Annabel did something that took his breath away. Standing up behind their barricade, she pulled the wooden cross from her neck and held it high where the attackers could see it. Her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the chaos of gunfire and shouting. "You want to know who killed Thomas Boone?" she called. "It was Sheriff Cassidy. He poisoned. A good man, because Thomas wouldn't help him steal cattle and terrorize innocent people." "Shut up." Cassidy's voice cracked like a whip. "Nobody's going to believe the word of a crazy woman." "Maybe not," Annabel continued, still standing tall despite the bullets flying around her. "But they might believe this." She pulled something from her dress of folded paper that caught the light as she held it up. Elijah's heart nearly stopped as he realized what it was. One of the documents from Thomas's hidden cache, somehow salvaged from the burning cabin. "This is a confession," she announced, written in Cassidy's own hand, detailing every crime he's committed and every person he's murdered, including Thomas Boone. The gunfire faltered as men on both sides processed what they'd heard. In that moment of relative quiet, Cassidy's voice rose in desperate fury. "She's lying. That paper's a fake, planted by the real criminals." "Then why don't you come in here and prove it?" Annabel challenged. "Come see for yourself what your friend wrote about you before he died." It was a bluff. The paper in her hand was actually one of Thomas's old letters, too damaged by fire and water to read clearly. But in the dim light of the mine, it looked official enough to give her words credibility. More importantly, it had the desired effect on Cassidy's men. Elijah could hear them talking among themselves, their voices carrying the uncertainty of men who were beginning to question what they'd been told. "Sheriff," one of them called out, "maybe we should take a look at that paper before we—" "The only thing you need to look at is your duty," Cassidy snapped. "These are dangerous criminals who've already killed one man. Are you going to let them talk their way out of justice?" But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and in the few seconds of hesitation that followed, everything changed. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, not the careful approach of hunters, but the urgent gallop of riders arriving in haste. Through the mine entrance, Elijah could see dust rising in the distance, kicked up by what looked like a substantial group of horsemen. "Who the hell?" Cassidy's voice carried genuine confusion and the first hint of fear Elijah had heard from him. U.S. Marshal Williams. A new voice called out, strong and authoritative. "By order of the territorial government, all parties are to lay down their weapons immediately." Elijah felt his heart skip a beat. Marshal Williams, the same man Thomas had been trying to contact in his unsent letters. The federal lawman who might actually have the authority to challenge Cassidy's corruption. "This is Sheriff Cassidy," the corrupt lawman called back, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm conducting official business here, pursuing dangerous fugitives." "Sheriff Cassidy, you're under arrest for murder, cattle rustling, and conspiracy against the territorial government," Marshal Williams replied. "Any man who continues to fire on these citizens will be charged as an accessory to your crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, one by one, Elijah heard the sound of weapons being lowered and men stepping away from the mine entrance. Whatever hold Cassidy had maintained over his deputies was crumbling in the face of federal authority. "This is impossible," Cassidy snarled, but his voice was moving away from the mine now, retreating toward whatever cover he could find. "You have no jurisdiction here." "I have jurisdiction wherever territorial law is being violated," Marshal Williams replied calmly. "And thanks to the evidence provided by concerned citizens, I have more than enough proof of your crimes to justify." Federal intervention. Evidence provided by concerned citizens. Elijah looked at Annabel, understanding dawning in his eyes. She smiled back at him, and for the first time since the shooting started, he saw hope in her expression. "The letters," he said quietly. "The ones you were writing before we found the cash in the chair. I mailed them during our last trip to town," she confirmed. "Copies of everything we discovered, plus my own testimony about what happened in Georgia. I figured if something happened to us, at least someone would know the truth." Brilliant. While he'd been focused on gathering evidence and preparing for a siege, she'd been thinking 3 steps ahead, ensuring that their story would survive even if they didn't. "Mr. Boone, Miss Hart," Marshal Williams called into the mine. "You're safe now. Please come out with your hands visible so we can sort this situation out properly." Elijah looked at Annabel one more time, hardly daring to believe that their ordeal might actually be over. "Ready to go home?" "Where's home?" she asked. "Wherever you are," he replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They walked out of the mine together, hands raised but heads high, blinking in the sudden brightness of morning sunlight. Around them, Cassidy's former deputies were surrendering their weapons to a squad of federal marshals, their faces showing the relief of men who'd realized they'd been following the wrong leader in the distance. Elijah could see Cassidy himself, being placed in shackles, the corrupt sheriff's face twisted with rage and disbelief at his downfall. The badge that had given him so much power now gleamed mockingly in the morning light, a symbol of authority he'd never deserved and would never wield again. Marshal Williams approached them, a tall man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's dark side. "Mr. Boone, Miss Hart," he said formally. "On behalf of the territorial government, I apologize for what you've endured. Justice has been a long time coming, but it's finally here." Elijah nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. After 2 years of grief and months of danger, it was hard to believe that the nightmare was actually over. "What happens now?" Annabel asked. "Now we rebuild," Marshal Williams said simply. "Your homestead can be restored, Cassidy's criminal network will be dismantled, and the people he's hurt will finally get the justice they deserve." As they walked down the mountain together, leaving the dark mine behind them, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, the possibility of a future worth looking forward to. A future built not on loss and regret, but on love, justice, and the hard-won knowledge that some things were indeed worth fighting for. 6 months later, Elijah stood in the doorway of their rebuilt cabin, watching Annabel tend the garden she'd planted in the spring. The morning glory vines she'd trained along the porch rail were in full bloom, their trumpet-shaped flowers, echoing the pattern Thomas had carved into the rocking chair that now sat in a place of honor beside the fireplace. The chair was finished now, its smooth curves polished to a warm glow that caught the afternoon light. Elijah had completed it during the long evenings while they'd waited for Cassidy's trial to conclude, each stroke of the sandpaper a meditation on loss, love, and the unexpected ways that life could circle back on itself. It hadn't been made for Annabel originally, but it fit her perfectly, as if Thomas had somehow known that his careful craftsmanship would eventually find its proper purpose. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," Annabel called, brushing dirt from her hands as she straightened. We'll have enough to can for winter, with plenty left over to share with the neighbors. Neighbors. That was still a new concept for Elijah, who'd spent 2 years believing himself forgotten by the world. But word of their story had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and newspaper accounts of Cassidy's spectacular downfall. The isolated homestead that had once seemed like the edge of nowhere now found itself on a well-traveled path, as people made small detours to meet the couple who'd brought down one of the territory's most corrupt officials. Most of the visitors were good folks' families heading west to start new lives, soldiers traveling between outposts, merchants looking for honest trading partners. They brought news from the outside world, letters from back east, and the kind of casual human connection that Elijah had forgotten he'd missed. Any word from Marshal Williams? Annabel asked, settling into the rocking chair with the easy grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Letter came this morning. Cassidy's appeal was denied. He'll spend the rest of his life in territorial prison, assuming the other inmates don't decide to deliver their own justice first. Elijah joined her on the porch, taking his place in the S.N. Simple wooden chair he'd built to match hers. Williams says the last of the corruption network has been rounded up. The new sheriff seems to be an honest man, and the territorial government is implementing reforms to prevent this from happening again. And the families in Georgia? The ones who were hurt? Compensation funds been established using assets seized from Cassidy's operation. It won't bring back the people he killed, but it'll help the survivors rebuild their lives. Annabel nodded, her hand unconsciously going to the wooden cross at her throat. She still wore it every day, but the gesture no longer carried the desperate quality of someone seeking protection from an uncertain fate. Now it seemed more like a quiet acknowledgement of blessings received and prayers answered. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail drew their attention to a small group of riders approaching the homestead. Elijah's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that still leaned against the cabin wall, old habits dying hard after months of danger. But these riders carried themselves with the easy confidence of friends rather than the purposeful tension of enemies. Pastor Morrison, Annabel said, recognizing the lead rider, and Sarah Chun from the Mercantile. What brings them all the way out here? Pastor Morrison was a circuit preacher who'd arrived in the territory shortly after Cassidy's arrest, drawn by reports of communities in need of spiritual guidance. Sarah Chun ran the general store in town with her husband and had become one of Annabel's closest friends during the long weeks of testimony and legal proceedings. Good afternoon, Elijah, Annabel, Pastor Morrison called as the group dismounted. Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we have some business to discuss. Always welcome, Elijah replied, though he wondered what could have brought his friends on the hour-long ride from town. Sarah Chun stepped forward, a mischievous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. We've been talking, the ladies in town and I, and we've come to a conclusion. What kind of conclusion? Annabel asked, though her own smile suggested she might already suspect the answer. The kind that says it's high time you two made this arrangement official, Pastor Morrison said with gentle authority. You've been through trials that would test any married couple, and you've proven yourselves to each other and to this community. The only thing missing is the ceremony. Elijah felt his heart skip a beat. They'd talked about marriage, of course, during the quiet evenings when the day's work was done, and they could speak freely about their hopes for the future. But somehow there had always seemed to be more pressing concerns rebuilding the homestead, testifying at trials, helping other victims of Cassidy's network find justice. We don't want to impose, he began, but Sarah Chun waved away his objection. Nonsense. Half the territory wants to attend your wedding, and the other half wants to throw the party afterward. You've given all of us something to celebrate proof that good people can triumph over corruption, that love can grow in the harshest circumstances. Besides, Pastor Morrison added with a twinkle in his eye, I've ridden a long way to perform this ceremony, and I'd hate to make the trip for nothing. Elijah looked at Annabel, seeing his own mixture of surprise and delight reflected in her eyes. They'd planned to marry eventually, but the idea of doing it now, surrounded by the community that had embraced them, felt both spontaneous and absolutely right. "What do you say?" he asked her. "Ready to make this official?" "I've been ready since the night you found me in that storm," she replied, standing and smoothing her simple dress. "Though I should warn you, I don't have anything fancy to wear." "Neither do I," Elijah admitted, suddenly conscious of his work clothes and calloused hands. "Love doesn't require fancy clothes," Pastor Morrison said gently. "It requires honest hearts and the courage to commit to each other before God and witnesses. I'd say you've already proven you have both." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, conducted on the porch of their rebuilt cabin with the Wyoming mountains rising majestically in the background. Sarah Chun produced a bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered along the trail, and Pastor Morrison spoke words about love, commitment, and the mysterious ways that Providence could bring two souls together in the vastness of an unforgiving land. When Elijah slipped the simple gold band he'd made in town onto Annabel's finger, he thought about all the paths that had led them to this moment: Thomas's death, Annabel's desperate flight west, the deception that had brought them together, the danger that had forged their love into something stronger than steel. "With this ring," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you for all the days of our lives." "And I promise," Annabel replied, her own voice thick with tears, "to be your partner in all things, to share your burdens and your joys, and to help you build a life worthy of the love we've found." As Pastor Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. Someone had brought a fiddle, and soon the porch was filled with music and laughter as their neighbors celebrated the union of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. Later, as the evening settled into comfortable conversation and shared stories, Elijah found himself standing apart from the group, watching Annabel as she moved among their guests with the natural grace of a woman who'd finally found her place in the world. "She's a remarkable woman," Pastor Morrison said, joining him at the porch rail. "That she is," Elijah agreed. "Your brother would have been proud of both of you." Elijah nodded, feeling Thomas's presence like a benediction in the evening air. His brother's death had nearly broken him, had left him believing that love was too dangerous a luxury for a man in his position. But Thomas's sacrifice had also brought Annabel into his life, had started a chain of events that led not just to personal happiness, but to justice for an entire community. "He would have liked her," Elijah said finally, "but I think he'd understand why things worked out the way they did." "Love has its own timing," Pastor Morrison observed. "Sometimes it comes when we expect it, sometimes when we need it most, and sometimes when we're finally ready to receive it properly." As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to make the ride back to town, Elijah and Annabel stood together on their porch, watching the last of the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The rocking chair creaked gently in the evening breeze, a sound that no longer spoke of loneliness, but of contentment. "Any regrets?" Elijah asked, taking his wife's hand in his. "About what?" "About coming west. About everything that brought you here." Annabel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that good people died. I regret that it took so long for justice to be served, but regret coming here? Regret finding you?" She squeezed his hand. "Never. Even though none of it turned out the way you planned. Especially because it didn't turn out the way I planned. The woman who got on that train in Georgia was looking for safety, for someone to take care of her and solve her problems. The woman standing here now has learned to take care of herself and fight for what's right. And what's that woman looking for now?" Annabel smiled, the expression radiant in the fading light. "Nothing. She's already found everything she needs?" As full darkness settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing with it the promise of stars and the distant call of coyotes, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Boone went inside their cabin to begin the first night of their married life. The rocking chair sat empty on the porch, waiting for the children who would eventually fill it with laughter, the grandchildren who would hear stories of the storm that brought their grandparents together, and the countless quiet evenings when two people who'd found love in the wilderness would sit together and watch the sun set over the mountains they'd learned to call home. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving, still full of dangers that could destroy the unwary or unprepared, but it was also full of possibilities for those brave enough to chase them, strong enough to endure the trials, and wise enough to recognize that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the greatest challenges dot in a land where survival was never guaranteed, and happiness was a luxury few could afford. Elijah and Annabel Boone had found both, and in finding them, they'd proven that love, justice, and hope could flourish even in the most unlikely places, nurtured by the simple. Determination to never give up on each other, or the promise of a better tomorrow.